Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix. I'm super stoked because today I'm going to talk about a movement called participatory journalism in my Writer's Writer series. I'm really excited, so without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, I chose the book How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. I chose it because while the discussion surrounding psychedelics is a little bit confusing to me because it's not really clear how to look at something that seems so mysterious, how it can affect us. But there are a lot of arguments that psychedelics are very good for helping people deal with their mental health. And it's very good for giving people a sense of oneness and comfort, and it seems to loosen up anxiety to where it doesn't have such a fixed hold. And I found this book, and I was interested in reading about it, not just because of the content of how Michael talks about the realities of psychedelics and how they're being used in a variety of ways to treat certain conditions, but I was also interested in the way in which the book is written. And so those two things definitely overlap. And there is a significant overlap because of the way that it gets me to think about writing. Now, for a little while, I was obsessed with creative nonfiction specifically because I was interested in the approach. I encourage you to check out my episode on creative nonfiction in my Writer's Writer series. But participatory journalism stands out to me for one reason, now that I can say this, now that I've read the book. And that reason is because of the way in which the writer is able to capture subjectivity, history, and science, or what you would call objectivity. And I think, as a proponent of participatory journalism, with the idea that you participate in the topics and issues that you cover, to where it isn't focused so much on the kind of standard objectivity that we expect from journalism, but is more kind of exploratory and even philosophical. And I think it's super interesting to me because I like that not only is there the contrast between the subjective and objective worlds, between neuroscience in the case of this book and autobiography in the case of Michael, who is his own subject when he takes psychedelics for his own reporting and his own experience, and also contrasting that with the history of psychedelics. Now, there's a lot that could be said about such an approach, but the reason why I want to talk about it here for the Writer's Writer is because, for me personally, I find it interesting to incorporate different elements into something you are writing or creating, or even the things that you're reading. I think so often we often look at art as having to be linear because that's the easiest way in which we can engage with it. It's more accessible. And while I would say that this book is incredibly accessible, I would have to say that the elements are very philosophical because he does talk about the neuroscience, which is scientific, but he also goes into the subjective mode by thinking about himself as a literal subject taking psychedelics. And I think we lose that idea of reportage and of personal transformation in our own writings. I think it's easy to focus on one theme and exclude the rest. I think we often forget that we ourselves are a subject in the world. And of course, there's a place for both objective and scientific reasoning and writing, just as there's a place for autobiography and the other elements that we bring in. And I think it's interesting because while we want to have that objectivity, we also do want autobiography because we're curious about what it's like to be the person experiencing something. And so in this case, I really would use and couldn't identify enough the term of reportage, where we've lost that first-person narration while being objective for treating yourself as a kind of object to be looked at. which might be an odd way of describing it, but it's the contrast between how we normally think of what is objective and what we normally think of is as subjective. And so journalism stands out to me. I haven't written a lot of journalism myself as an actual reporter, but I have written a lot in nonfiction, and I think it's easy to forget that it can be exciting when you see yourself trying to get the facts on the ground, when you're on the ground, when you're engaging with it. And I think while, of course, we can write in a variety of different ways, I think that it takes a certain kind of courage and bravery to look at it in terms of your own understanding of yourself as someone who is reporting the details. And I find that fascinating. Now, what I want to say about this book to encourage people to write their own stories is to not just look at yourself as someone who is reporting something, someone who's seeing it happen in real time, but also trying to push yourself to be maybe a little bit more philosophical. Maybe see yourself as being able to be creative in that way, to where you don't have to stick with just one form when you're describing something. You can try what you could call modes or perspectives, which is basically what I think Michael Pollan is doing, because of course he has the scientific perspective of the neuroscience of psychedelics, but he's also talking about it in terms of his own experience, and then of course the more, for lack of a better phrase, objective history. I only say that in scare quotes, not because history isn't accurate, but because I think people tend to be a little bit more critical of history, especially if it's just an individual accounting it. But I think it counts as historical knowledge because he's really looking at what happened in the history of psychedelics. And he does that because he's trying to capture this idea of how people turned away from psychedelics until there's this new wave of research where people are really trying to see if this is a good thing. And so I would say that, yeah, try to be more philosophical, because he's not just thinking about his own experience with psychedelics. He's looking at it in terms of what he calls ego disillusion, which is when you're actually able to disconnect from your sense of self and you're able to engage in oneness. This is something that meditation is supposed to bring people, for instance, but psychedelics can do this as well, according to Michael Pollan. And the ego disillusion is, and it's the same thing for certain religious and spiritual experiences. You're said to become so dissolved from your ego that you can see things in a more holistic way. And I would have to also acknowledge that this has been talked about before, such as in Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, where he was talking a lot about how you don't see yourself so much as a subject when you're taking the psychedelics. But the philosophy doesn't come from just the form, even though I think that's an effective way to write. It also comes from the ideas themselves. And it would almost seem that because he's so creative with his approach with writing, that maybe the content doesn't even matter as much. Maybe it really is the form. It's always something I find interesting. But I do find it interesting because he's thinking about these big questions. He's thinking about death. He's thinking about suffering. He's thinking about addiction and depression. And he's trying to look at a way that a healthy regimen or dosage of certain psychedelics can actually help you to grasp what that is. Now, I want to say from an ethical perspective, I'm a little bit torn, because I don't know that necessarily it should be a situation where we're pushing psychedelics as a treatment, because I think if we push treatments, I think it can be too much. But that, I think, was the most powerful rhetorical thing that he did, was writing about his own experience with the psychedelics. And it is philosophical, because he's trying to get at the root of why many of these things both fascinate us, but also trouble us. How is it that there can be so much mystery in the world, and yet also be a lot of suffering? And so I do think that the book focuses a lot on psychedelics specifically, which made it a little bit less interesting for me. But I do think what made it carry through for me was, again, the first-person perspective of what he experiences in real time. And I can't identify enough that idea of reportage, and not just treating an issue as just something to write about in an objective and linear way, but really trying to delve into it. I wouldn't necessarily say that this book is creative writing, or even creative nonfiction necessarily, because I do think it is very factual with how he approaches it, which I think is a great approach when you're talking about something like this. But I also think there's enough of the creative elements with how he thinks about the different forms and how he thinks about the way that these things are. And I just wanted to say, I think participatory journalism is an interesting way of approaching the world and an interesting way of approaching your writing. And if I was going to give one solid thought about what this means for me to kind of apply it to my own life, I would recognize that I want to try to delve in to the experience of not just ego dissolution, but also experience itself. I want to live fully. I want to be able to act as if I'm some kind of reporter or a writer that's seeing it in real time. And we know that this is an old tradition. Even writers that were more creative in some ways, like Ernest Hemingway, were part of this, where they were kind of documenting things. And there's a big tradition in new journalism and journalism in general, and even just nonfiction. And I find it to be very fascinating. But I would say that I would like to be more open in my thinking, and that also includes being more open in my writing. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for watching. I hope that you'll check out the other episodes in the Writer's Writer series, and I hope that you'll check out my books, and I hope that you'll also check out my other videos on my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon.